Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the north in the direction of Kotlyarivka and Kislivka, where the Russians have made an advance within the village of Kotlyarivka, getting a foothold within the northern parts of it and pushing the Ukrainians into the western parts of it. We see that heavy fighting is taking place both in the direction of Kislivka and Kotlyarivka, where the Russians are trying to gain control over the twin village before moving on to the fortifications associated with those, before moving on in a northern direction towards Ivanivka and Stepovo-Novoselivka. In this section of the front line, it is important for the Russians to continue pushing on after the capture of these two villages to gain full control over the heights in the area. Taking a look at the topographic map of the area, we see here Kislivka and Kotlyarivka are located in the high grounds at an elevation of about 200 meters, where the Russians have taken control over the high ground of these villages. Now is the time for the Russians to move on towards Ivanivka and Stepovo-Novoselivka here to the north, where they can continue along the railways, which are also located at the heights. This will allow the Russians to continue pushing westwards and gain control over these villages, all of the villages in the area, by gaining control over the high grounds, before moving on to occupy all of the high grounds here in the east of Kupiansk, which is located here on the left side of the screen. So we see all of the high grounds are related to these four villages here in the section of the front line, and the Russians are looking to gain full control of them by pushing in a western direction. Continuing along the railway will also push Russia towards Pyshane, and after gaining control of Pyshane, the Russians would have control of all of the villages east of Kupiansk, except for the ones right by the riverbank, which include Petropavlivka, Kotlyarivka, Sinkivka in the north, and Podoli, Kurivlivka, and Kivsherivka here to the south. So we see that the Ukrainians still have several villages along the Uskal river line, which they can hold as a final line of defense before the river line. But we do see that the Russians are pushing on here in the east and hitting the Ukrainian combined defensive force of these four villages by pushing through Kislivka and Kotlyarivka before moving on to Stepovo-Novoselivka and Ivanivka. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Bakhmut there are several developments. In the north there is the shielded footage showing a Ukrainian tank attacking here from the northern direction towards Bohdanivka in an attempt to regain a foothold within the village, or simply to provide fire on the Russian positions within the village. However, a Russian ATGM actually hit that tank here in its position northwest of Bohdanivka. So we see that the Ukrainians still make use of the fortifications north of Bohdanivka to launch counterattacks into the village in an attempt to prevent the Russians from taking advantage of their control of the village. A bit further south, we see here in the main eastern parts of Chasiv Yar, we see that the Russians have reported to start an assault both from the east and from the south, according to some reports from the north as well, through the forest patch. And with this, we see that the Russians are attacking the Ukrainians heavily, storming it with the 98th Air Assault Division of the Russian Armed Forces towards the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar. The main target here by the Russians is 2 points. The first is the high-rise buildings here in the south. The Russians have an interest in gaining control over all of those to securely gain control over the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar. And the second part is the factory area here to the north, where there's a car factory and additional high-rise buildings. The main part of Chasiv Yar here to the east is significantly well fortified, considering all of the high-rise buildings and the factory, car depot areas, etc. That all prevents the Russians from making and taking the full advantage of their artillery. Compared to the residential area here just west of the canal, this is an area that is much easier to conquer, considering that the buildings are all individual houses that are typically not as well fortified as, or even closely as well fortified as, these Ukrainian high-rise buildings. It is reported that this assault took place after the Russians gained control over the final high ground areas here to the south of it. Taking a look at the topographic map, we see that here to the south of the village, the forest patch here is at the outskirts of the high ground, where they move a bit further to the north, and suddenly they are at the high ground areas south of the residential area here to the eastern parts of Chasiv Yar. So the Russians are planning on moving through the forest line and then in a northern direction, and this is what they have done to then gain a advantage when storming the city parts. Here to the east, they are located at the low ground at a height elevation of about 211 meters compared to 228 in the city center. Adding on top of that the heights of the high-rise buildings of about 10 to 15, even 20 meters, then suddenly the height advantage is very significant for the Ukrainian side. Now, if they attack from the south, it would be pretty much even despite the buildings' heights, which means that the Russians would be able to storm it without much difficulty based on the geographic conditions. Here to the west of the canal, the height elevation goes much further to 246 meters compared to the 230 here. And on top of that, there are high-rise buildings there as well as the industrial areas of the city. The Battle of Chasiv Yar is nowhere near over, but it is starting to get serious. We then move on to the south of Bakhmut, here north of Kotlyarivka. The Russians have recaptured some territory after the Ukrainians pushed them back, following the recent Russian successes in the area. Now with this, the Russians have resecured the area north of Kotlyarivka, according to this geolocated footage here, showing the Russian advance by the section of the front line. We then move further south in the north of Donetsk, north of Avdiivka. The Ukrainians have withdrawn from Arkhangelsk and the Russians have advanced north of Keramik. This still frame of my screen and the title I just spoke out would be the headline of a newspaper 50 years ago. But today, with all of the technology we have and all of the information we receive, I'm able to show both this geolocated picture and the associated footage of Ukrainian soldiers leaving the village and running northwards in this tight column single file line. Before this video ends, and I'll have to cut it short, the Russians hit the line with an artillery strike. However, how effective that artillery strike was, I cannot say, because hardly any of the soldiers were hit. And we do not see any follow-up strikes based on this drone footage. However, we do see that they were extremely vulnerable, and if the Russians followed up with cluster munitions strikes, the Ukrainians could have suffered a lot of casualties. This is the exact same way they withdrew from the village of Lestoshkine to Orlivka when the Russians took control of Avdiivka, and back then it was hit by MLRS strikes. If something similar happened this time around, the Ukrainians could have suffered a lot of casualties. The Ukrainians withdrew from the fortifications and the village itself to the heights and fortified positions to the north of Arkhangelsk. This would leave the Ukrainians in a safer position, and the Russians would gain control over Arkhangelsk. This is a smart move by the Ukrainians, as if the Russians did continue flanking their Ukrainian positions from the west, they would be able to cut off the Ukrainians within the village itself. So whoever took control and command of the soldiers in the village made the right decision. And that is it for this section of the front line, and we move on to the final town, which is Novomikhailivka, where the Russians restarted offensive operations west of the town in the direction of Paraskovivka and Konstantinivka. We have previously seen these Russian advances here directly west of Novomikhailivka, allowing them to align the front line with the first line alongside the town. And now offensive operations have started in the northern direction towards Paraskovivka. The Russians here attempt to gain control over Paraskovivka before moving on to Konstantinivka. And with that, we end off this video. We see that the Russians have started offensive operations by Novomikhailivka. In the north of Donetsk, north of Avdiivka, offensive operations by the Russians continue as the Ukrainians are forced to withdraw due to heavy Russian pressure. West of Bakhmut, offensive operations restarted in the direction of the east of Chasiv Yar, and in the north the Russians started attacking and pushing through Kotlyarivka as well as Kislivka, pressuring the Ukrainian fortifications and fortified areas in the north. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.